Apollo 8 to the LBJ Auditorium. Colonel Frank Borman, the commander, Captain James Lovell, the command module pilot, and General William Anders, the lunar module pilot. These American heroes were the first humans to see the far side of the moon, and also to see the planet Earth from orbit about another celestial body. With them is our moderator for tonight's program, Jim Hartz, who is former co-anchor of NBC's Today Show and host for the PBS show Innovation, and who began covering NASA during the Gemini program and then covered every manned spaceflight after that through the early shuttle programs. We're lucky also to have members of their families with us tonight. Colonel Borman's wife, Susan, Captain Lovell's wife, Marilyn, daughter Barbara Harrison, son-in-law Ken Harrison, and grandson Tom Williams, and Jim Hart's wife, Alexandra. These astronauts on stage aren't the only heroes who made Apollo 8 possible. I want to introduce some other Apollo 8 alumni, and as I do so, could I ask them to stand, turn around to face the audience, and remain standing. And let me ask the audience to please hold their applause until everyone is introduced. Chris Kraft, Director of Flight Operations and former Director of the Johnson Space Center. Glenn Lunny, Flight Director, Black Team. Milton Windler, Flight Director, Maroon Team. Apollo astronauts who were support crew, Capcom, T.K. Mattingly, Vance Brand. A former Director of the Johnson Space Center who was involved in Apollo 8, Aaron Cohen of the Apollo Project Office. And now to join them, would all the Apollo 8 alumni please stand and allow us to honor you with our appreciative applause. I would ask you to stand and remain standing until everyone is introduced. Richard Garriott, who's just returned from the International Space Station, son of NASA astronaut Owen Garriott, and Dr. Larry Faulkner, former president of the University of Texas and a member of the LBJ Foundation Board, Ben Barnes, former lieutenant governor of Texas and member of the LBJ Foundation Board, former U.S. Senator Bill Bradley, Dr. Hans Mark, the former deputy administrator of NASA, former chancellor of the University of Texas and currently a professor in the UT Aerospace Engineering and Mechanical Engineering Department, Catherine Robb, head of the LBJ Future Forum and LBJ's granddaughter, and her mother, who is right here on stage with us, Linda Robb, LBJ's granddaughter, LBJ's daughter. I get to say Catherine's mother and LBJ's daughter. And Edith Royal and former UT football coach Darrell Royal, who loaned to the library flags that flew on 3 Apollo missions, including one from Apollo 8 that's signed by the 3 astronauts. You can see those in the library's Centennial exhibit, To the Moon, the American space program in the 1960s, which will be here through Labor Day. We're celebrating all those who made Apollo 8 possible, and we're also celebrating the 50th anniversary of NASA and the centennial of the birth of President Lyndon Johnson, who co-sponsored the legislation that created NASA. Later, as president, LBJ guided the Apollo program through Congress and made sure it was funded and supported. The 1960s were years of cultural tumult, war, and political and racial strife, and 1968 was a particularly difficult year, with assassinations, riots in the cities, and a major setback in Vietnam. But in December, at the end of that terrible year, our hearts were lifted by the crew of Apollo 8 reading from Genesis and bringing us that wonderful picture of Earthrise that allowed us to see, for the first time, how fragile and wonderful our world really is. Of the many precious objects we house in the LBJ Library, one of my very favorites is this picture of Earthrise, signed by the 3 Apollo astronauts and given to President Johnson. You know, President Johnson sent pictures that these astronauts took. He sent them to every head of state throughout the world, even those with whom we had no diplomatic relationships, and even including Ho Chi Minh. You know, this is during the Vietnam War. And we had spent a lot of time trying to make direct contact with Ho Chi Minh, trying to talk with him. You know, LBJ thought, come let us reason together. If I could only talk with him and give him a dam or two, you know, we could get this war ended here. And we actually got a thank you card from Ho Chi Minh by way of Berlin, and it says in French, "Thank you for sending the photographs of the moon taken by Apollo 8. That's also in the library. It's a very precious thing, I think. Now, before our moderator, Jim Hartz, leads us into the panel, it's my pleasure to welcome Linda Johnson-Robb to the podium with some personal remarks. Linda?
On behalf of the Johnson family, I'm so honored to be able to be here to thank you in person for coming. As Betty Sue said, your flight raised our spirits so much. I told my husband, I said, you don't know what 1968 was like. You were lucky you were in Vietnam. And I didn't even mean it to be funny. Your flight was the second best thing that happened in '68, only behind the birth of Lucinda Robb. I told her today, I said, Lucinda, do you remember you were 2 months old on that Christmas day when they read? She was born on October 25th. She said, well, really not very well. But we feel a deep connection to y'all, and we thank you so much for the spirit that you raised for all of us. Daddy cared very much about the space program. I remember walking down to the graveyard and looking up, and Daddy was saying, you see that Sputnik up there? We've got to do something. We've got to have our own space program. And from then on, the space program was one of his children. He cared so much about it. And he was so proud of y'all. And I was there the day that he presented you all with the NASA, I don't even know, the Distinguished Medal. I have to look at my notes to tell you what it's really supposed to be called. But I remember being there, and you just raised all of our spirits. And last week, or the 13th actually, Tom Brokaw was here speaking about the 60s particularly. And he said that, I have to quote him here, if I can find him, that, well, I guess I've lost the card. Oh no, here we go. Well, no, I've lost the card. Okay, here we go. I just got back from Big Bend, and I'll tell you, these men, where they went, it could not have been as far away as Big Bend. God knows. But he also was talking to us, and he said that when Captain Lovell put his thumb up and said that it covered his entire view of Earth, making us realize how insignificant we all are. And I think we're all much more aware of that now than we even were in '68, and reminds us of all the challenges that we had then and all the challenges that we have now to take care of our wonderful planet Earth. And I look forward to hearing all the things you're going to say. So I'm going to go sit down and get y'all coming.
Looking out over the audience here, I can see that there are some gray beards, so I don't have to tell you about the Apollo program, but there are some young folks here who, you had to be 40 years old, first of all, to even have been born at the time, and you needed to be 50 or 60 to sort of understand what was happening. So let me set the stage just for a minute or two here about what was happening in 1968, 1969. We're going to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the actual landing on the moon this coming July. There are lots of folks here who work behind the scenes at NASA, mostly at Houston and down at the Kennedy Space Center. And I'll tell you a little secret. Among the folks at NASA and among the folks who were in my business who covered the space program, we each had a favorite flight. If you were a scientist, you sort of liked Apollo 17 because Jack Smith, who was a geologist, was on that flight. If you were sort of sentimental, you liked Apollo 14 because Alan Shepard, the first American in space, commanded that flight. My favorite was Apollo 12 because I got to know and be close friends with Pete Conrad and Al Bean, whose paintings are at an exhibition here at the library. Then, of course, there was Apollo 11, which was the first landing on the moon. Most people, however, don't know that much about what we're going to talk about tonight, Apollo 8. In the Apollo program, there was a very carefully laid out sequence of events, of test flights, each step taking us closer and closer to the moon. And each flight had a set of parameters and a set of goals that were to be attained, and then we would move on to the next flight. During the middle 60s, coming up to the middle of 1968, there were some problems that developed. The moon lunar modules, they were called, were running behind in schedules, and so the flight that these guys were on was intended to be something totally different. It was going to be a full-up test flight of all the equipment that was going to be used on the Apollo lunar flights, but it would be here in Earth orbit. And if you recall, during those days, you were never more than a few minutes or at least a few hours from safety if anything went wrong. But a decision was made and then held very closely in NASA. Those of us in the news business didn't really know about it until later, to go ahead and use this flight to do something really, in my terms, in the news business terms, dramatic. For NASA, it was a logical step. It meant to scrap the program that they were going to use in low Earth orbit and to actually go to the moon, and even though they didn't have a lunar landing module, to circle the moon and test all of the systems that were going to be used a little bit later on. It was such, and it was the first time, let's be clear here, that men had flown on the big Saturn V rocket. For those of you who don't remember, it was 36 stories tall. It weighed 7.5 million pounds, most of that highly volatile fuel. There had been no manned flights before. The previous flight had a lot of problems. While they were getting ready to go, a hurricane came through and brushed up the side of Florida. The rocket itself, or the gantry, was hit by lightning, I think. Was there anything else that went wrong? Any further tensions that could possibly be built there? And the decision was made by the NASA folks, and these three guys said, "Yes, sir, we're ready, let's go." That was one of the things that impressed me so much of covering NASA, is the can-do spirit that I saw from the beginning to the end of it. And I think that the reason why that this room is full tonight is because we look back on that period, and it's personified by not only these three guys, but there's another 100 or so sitting out here in the first 5 or 6 rows who were a big part of it too. So, with that stage set, I'd like to begin to let you hear the true story from the three folks who are here this evening. Frank, you told me earlier that you'd like to elaborate on what I was saying about these people who are here tonight.
Yeah, you know, it's very dangerous. One of the ways you could really get in trouble in the astronaut program was to say, well, the astronauts think this or the astronauts think that. John Glenn used to really irritate me when he would run problems because I didn't think like John Glenn at all, but nevertheless I was accused of thinking. But I have checked with my two wonderful companions, and they agree with me that we really owe a debt of gratitude to the Apollo alumni here. You have not received near the credit you deserve. We wouldn't be here today without you, and it chokes me up just thinking of the trust that we had in you. And one guy really personifies it. Of all the people that made NASA work, the real giants in NASA, there's really only one left, and that's Chris Kraft. And so wonderful. That's nonsense. They weren't any better than you guys. The average age of the people that programmed our trajectory was 24 years. You guys were the best and you can do a hell of a lot better job than anybody's doing today, and we appreciate you.
We got another hour going. Let's walk through the flight. I said a minute ago that the previous Saturn V that had been launched prior to you guys, it was a few months, had a lot of problems. First of all, the final stage, the third stage that was actually going to send you to the moon on that flight, didn't fire. And it did another little thing called a pogo. What was a pogo? How could a 30-story, 5-story building pogo?
Well, one of the test flights, as I recall, this is 40 years ago, of course, was the fact that we had an engine that went into a vibration sort of a thing on the structure, and we were afraid that if it disintegrated, it would ruin the whole day of the flight. And so this was something that the engineers that had designed, of course, the rocket Huntsville has said, we have that solved. We think that we have the confidence in our Saturn V, and in a discussion with all the NASA people who were making the decision at that time to change the flight from an Earth orbital to a flight to the moon, which of course was, I think, initiated by George Lovell, if I'm not mistaken, if I'm not correct, Chris, and then just decided upon and brought up to the hierarchy in Washington and said, we can do it. And so the pogo situation was taken care of. That, by the way, happened on Apollo 13.
A little bit on 8.
On the second stage, we had a pogo on the second stage. But
Okay.
that's another story.
We'll get to 13 in a little bit. You were the first 3 guys who sat on top of this big machine and were launched into space. What was going through your, well, let me back up just a little bit. What went through your mind when they told you that you were going to not do the orbital flight on Earth, but you were actually going to do this circumlunar flight? Bill?
Well, actually, I was a little disappointed.
Why is that?
Because I've been training for the lunar module, checking out in the lunar landing training vehicle, and I thought, well, we can just get Apollo 8 out of the way, I maybe be on Apollo 14 or something. I didn't realize that going on Apollo 8 as the Lunar Module Pilot would sort of promote me to the command module position. So I was a little disappointed, but as Frank is, I think, said very cogently, that Apollo, it wasn't a program of science all that much. Sure, we picked up rocks. Sure, we were interested in exploration. It was another battle in the Cold War. And if it hadn't been for the Russians, we wouldn't have had the public support to pay the taxes that are required to beat those dirty commies. That's what it was. And so I was quite pleased with the opportunity being an Air Force officer to have a chance to be involved in Apollo 8.
For the younger folks who were here, what was the Cold War like at that time, and what were the Russians doing, and what were we doing to counter that?
Well, if I can answer that question,
Sure.
There was perceived that the Soviets were more technically advanced with regards to spaceflight. After all, they put up Gagarin before we did. He went into orbit, and Shepard just went into a 15-minute suborbital flight. Then they put up 2 people, and we still hadn't gotten up to them. So the idea was that the technology and the prestige of being a leader in this technology was very, very important. I think it is if we want to be a leader in the world. And it wasn't until the Gemini flights started to go, where we started to do Rendezvous and EVA, and finally working up to the end of the Gemini program, that we were catching up with them. And of course, the epitome was Apollo 8 going to the moon. And we know now, of course, from all discussions with the Russians, that they were very active in a lunar program, and that they had almost decided to to send 2 people in circumnavigating the moon, but they were very conservative too. And they had sent 2 flights around the moon in '68, and of course we had information about that, and that's why that decision was made for us to go to the moon. We launched, and while they were deciding whether to send 2 cosmonauts on Proton and Mazam to also circumnavigate the moon.
Was that the reason why it was sort of kept a secret, your flight, until a few weeks before it happened?
I think it was kept a secret for a good reason, because the flight plan generated it from Houston, and it had to go up and be approved by the NASA headquarters and then by President Johnson. But I don't think we fully realize often enough the impact that President Johnson had on the space program. President Kennedy announced it, got all of it. It's kind of like there's between us and the ground people. He got all the credit for it. But President Johnson, as head of the Space Council, really brought the lunar fight forward. And then he had a wonderful relationship with another giant who's now dead, and that's Jim Webb, who was administrator of NASA. And he didn't try to direct it. He had so much trust in Webb, and Webb picked the leaders like crap. And so it was a wonderful, wonderful management. I've often thought if the Defense Department would have had Webb instead of McNamara, they'd have been a hell of a lot better off. But we were very, very fortunate to have President Johnson and Jim Webb at the top, because they listened to the people. They picked the people who knew what they were doing, then they listened to them. I'm sure it didn't take 17 phone calls for them to launch Apollo 8, you know.
But the other criterion, though, Frank, was the fact that Gemini or Apollo 7 had to be successful for their
That was 12 and long.
and their Earth orbital flight to make sure the command module was ready, since we didn't have a lunar module. Once that final test was done, then the decision, of course, was made for 8 to go to the moon.
Were you confident from the beginning it was all going to work?
Well, personally, I had a lot of confidence in NASA, not just JSC, but the people designing the boosters, the aerospace industry. Frank put a lot of time in getting Apollo kind of back on the track, along with Chris Kraft and his team after the fire. So I had a lot of confidence, but I didn't think it was a slam dunk. I frankly thought that well, there's probably a 1/3 chance of a totally successful mission. There's probably a 1/3 chance of an Apollo 13 mission where you went but you didn't accomplish the goal, and there was a 1/3 chance that you didn't come back. But as I said, this was the Cold War was alive and well. You can't really understand Apollo without putting it in the context of the Cold War, which in retrospect, is a little strange from these years. But as a military officer, I thought that was pretty good odds. We had our colleagues being shot down in Vietnam without any glory, and so I didn't think it was totally safe. But I had confidence that it was going to be as good as it could be. But they no sooner lit off these engines. Now keep in mind that we had simulated people masochistic kind of things that they thought about, and how to screw things up and for doing on the ground. And so, boy, you had 16 problems going at once. But you simulated, as far as I knew, when I was sitting there waiting for the lift ignition, that, well, we've covered everything, we've done launch abort, and Frank knows when to twist the handle if he has to. And that thing no sooner lit off, but it shook so hard, and it made so much noise, which we hadn't simulated at all. I thought, oh, shucks, we really missed this one. Frank was smart enough to take his hand off the abort handle, because, literally, I felt like I was a rat in the jaws of a big terrier.
We compressed into 4 months really. The training normally takes about 18 months. So we specialized. Bill was competent with the systems, knew everything about it. Jim was a navigator, and I sort of was the overall re-entry. And I have complete confidence in these 2 people. They're wonderful. I couldn't add a better crew than Jim and Bill. I had complete confidence in the ground. I'm not kidding you. I really did. As a matter of fact, on Apollo 7, we would have blown it, because convinced that not Apollo 7, Gemini 7, because I was convinced that the fuel cells weren't going to work. And Chris got on the radio one of the times and said, we've simulated it, so they're going to work. That was it. I went to sleep. I had that kind of confidence. My main concern was that somehow the crew would screw up. No, the three of us. I didn't want to be the guy that boarded when we didn't have to.
Tell them about the handle of the launch.
Well, the handle, you sit over here, and if you turn it outbound, you're gone.
Tell me how that worked.
Well, you had about 70,000 pound
You only use that on the launch phase if the rocket catches on fire or something like that, and there's an abort handle that the commander can throw, and a rocket then takes the spacecraft off, plunks it into the ocean. But the G-force is about 20 Gs. You don't want to do that.
Well, I wanted us to do a perfect mission. I had confidence in it, and it turned out that way. I didn't have any worry about anybody else.
It really was almost a perfect mission.
Actually, I was a little disappointed.
It wasn't perfect.
I was disappointed because the people on the ground and the engineers had made Apollo 8 so perfect that I couldn't demonstrate what a great guy I was in fixing it.
My views of being selected, and of course, I wasn't on that mission to begin with. Mike Collins was the third person on the original crew of Apollo 8 at that time. I think it was called 8 at that time, or maybe it was 9 at that time, I forget. And then Mike had a medical problem, so I replaced him. So I was sort of the oddball guy out. But when the decision was made to go to the moon, personally, I was elated, because I was not looking forward to another Earth orbital flight with Frank Borman. You see, I spent 14 days with this guy.
They came back engaged.
The way things are now, we could get married.
Where do I go from here?
Don't ask.
What they're referring to, the Gemini flights were the precursors to Apollo. It was a two-man capsule. It was very small. It was about half the size of a Volkswagen. And they flew it was a 14-day mission, right?
Yeah.
And all of those Gemini flights were, again, a stepping stone to Apollo, and mostly it was involved in developing rendezvous techniques, because we knew at that point that there was going to have to be rendezvous. Really at that point it had been made a decision to do lunar rendezvous rather than Earth rendezvous. So all those things had to work right, and it was that experience that made it a success. Now, let's keep going through the flight here. You've gotten through launch. You're the rat caught in the can over there. You get into Earth orbit and begin to check out the systems. And the third stage of the Saturn, the S4B it was called, must then fire to send you on a trajectory to the moon. The last time this was tried, it didn't happen. What was going through your mind there at the lead up to that, and tell us how that went?
Well, I was focused on it working. I never even thought about it not working. I don't know how you guys were. I just figured it was going to work.
But with that thrust and looking at the watch, and it just kept burning and burning,
It burned, what, 5 minutes or something?
F equal M8 or A equals.
No, I was just watching our velocity continue to go up and up.
Yeah.
And,
Well, you didn't worry about it not lighting off, did you?
oh, no, I
After they fixed
know, and I don't think
They fixed it.
Yeah.
where we worried about lighting off, of course, was number one, slowing down to be captured by the moon, and then 9 orbits or 10 orbits later, lighting the maneuvering engine to get away from the moon. I mean, to get out of lunar orbit.
Begin ahead of the story.
Yeah, that's what we didn't like. We could come back.
Right, we were still in Earth orbit.
Yeah. And that, as I recall now, you guys, I know you keep me honest, but it was a quiet, smooth burn.
Yeah.
No pogo, no nothing. He just accelerated. The
Steady
only reason you could
push.
tell you were moving with the slight G-force and the numbers on it was the velocity.
Okay. After now, this maneuver was called TLI, translunar injection. NASA had these wonderful acronyms for absolutely everything. I always felt my job was sort of like a simultaneous translator at the United Nations. I listened to the NASA thing in one ear, and supposedly English came out of the mouth. Some days it did, and some days it didn't. You've now done something that no other man has ever done, the three of you. You've broken the gravity of the Earth and are moving to another celestial body. And she was quoting Tom Brokaw a while ago, saying you could look out the window and see, what was it like to look out the window and see the Earth gradually getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and knowing that everybody was there?
You could actually, the first time we turned around, we were about 20,000 miles out, I think, which jettisoned the third stage. And it was kind of like when you're a kid in the third grade, you're watching the clock, you know, where you couldn't see it move, but if you looked away and looked back, it got a little smaller. We were a long way out. We knew we were moving.
To me, it looked like looking at the Earth when we had that initial velocity was in an automobile going into a tunnel and looking out the back window and seeing the entrance get smaller and smaller and smaller as we went down through the tunnel. Very similar, because our velocity was very great at that particular time. It slowed down as we went out.
How fast are you going at that point?
You know, probably around 23,500, 24,000 miles an hour. Not quite escape velocity.
Now comes a period of quietude. You've got, what, 2 days with not much to do?
You might as well get it out right now. I got motion sick and pukes.
Frank, we weren't going to say anything.
I read now, I said, oh, they were thinking, like NASA was thinking about canceling the mission and all that. I want to tell you something, we would have had radio failure. If you ever sent that up, Chris, no way. But I got over in a hurry, and I think that it was clearly, although I didn't think so at the time, because I'd flown 2 weeks in Gemini without getting sick. I've never been sick in an airplane except when I was hungover. I don't really believe, I think it was a motion sickness.
Well, I convinced Frank that we ought to give the ground some
Yeah, it's your fault.
some kind of signal. Well, after I had to bat all that stuff away, but we had a tape recorder that the ground could command on a private channel, because everything we said, went out to the world. So Frank, I got him on the tape recorder, and I figured, and I made some comment about, well, you guys, maybe you'll check the tape sometime. I don't know where Chuck Berry was, maybe he was sound asleep, but about 8 hours later, all hell broke loose. They finally listened to the tape recorder. By this time, Frank had recovered, so thank God they didn't cancel the flight.
No, we weren't going to cancel. We would have shut down the radio. We knew what happened.
No, good friend, though.
This is another thing they never told us journalists. We never knew about this until many years later. I see, you mentioned Dr. Berry. Dr. Chuck Berry was the astronaut physician for many, many years. He's here tonight. That motion sickness, it didn't only happen to you, it happened to some other people, and there was no predicting it, is my understanding. And it was not like air sickness, was it?
I don't know about it. I mean, I just got nauseated, and I thought it was because I'd taken a Seconal, which was a sleeping. I never take pills, and I'd taken one, and I thought that's what done it. But I never did it, but I believe now I probably have motion sickness.
I think it's a common phenomenon. I think most of the astronauts, even today in the shuttle, for the first 6 hours, if you're not careful, if you start moving sideways and things like that, you can get nauseous. So it's a phenomenon.
Well, you and Bill both said you felt queasy.
Yeah, when I got out of the seat for the first time, my job was to collect the helmets, and I thought, well, I'll just do a little nip up, And I did 2 of them and said, I'm laying down.
Did you get sick on 13?
No, surprisingly, I did not. But on 8, when I first got out, because I had to do some work too, I felt a little nauseous. But I kept kept my head straight ahead.
That was CO2.
And that way, you grin and bear it, and after a while, your stomach gets used to it. In fact, most people, the stomach gets used to it.
Weightless is a much different feeling than motion sickness, though, isn't it? I mean, this is something that only a few guys in the world and women have been able to experience.
It's comfortable.
It's lethargic, it's tranquil.
Explain that.
Well, I mean, you don't have the weight of moving around. I mean, you can do things with a push of your finger, and once you get used to the zero gravity, there is no up or down, really. You know, it depends on your own orientation with respect to inside the spacecraft. So, actually, it's a nice environment. I think that anybody here could go out and be in zero gravity. It's coming back to Earth that is the strenuous part of spaceflight.
All of a sudden you're back.
Well, initially, your heart, is used to pumping blood from your feet to your head while you're walking around. And so, at least for me, my ears were pounding. The lobes, I could feel it, and it wasn't that comfortable. But after a while, the old heart said, why am I doing this? And after about 2 days, it quit doing it. Well, I'll tell you, when I got on that aircraft carrier after only 6.5 days in space, not like 6 months like these space station people do, I had a hard time getting up the ladder, going to the bridge to shake the Admiral's hand. My heart started banging away. And so zero G is comfortable, but it's like laying in bed for a long time bed rest. You got to, now they exercise, and so it's comfortable, but it has its disadvantages.
Yeah, I think you have to give a lot of credit to people that are on the space station now that stay up there that long and come back. There's no way in God's green earth you could get me up there for as long as you can only look out the window and say, ooh, and ah, so long.
I never thought about it that way. Okay, I swear to you, Frank, I was not going to bring up the issue of puking.
I brought it up for you.
So, now we come to a very interesting point in the flight. You're coming to the moon. You have to you have to fire the engine to put you into a lunar orbit. You're going, I'm going to let you tell us, but you're going backwards. You can't see anything. You're in the dark. You're on your own. You're out of contact with the ground. What's going on there, and what's going on in your mind?
Well, Bill has it.
Well, we were going backwards to the moon, and you simulator guys will remember that Frank was psychotic about, concerned about the so-called LOS, the loss of signal time, because he rightly determined that if the people on the ground were smart enough to know when the spacecraft would go behind the moon, we had instantaneous cutoff of the radios, and they were probably smart enough to know that we weren't going to hit it on the backside. So all during our simulations, Bill, make sure you got that time down, and we'd simulate. How did you do? Right on, Frank, take it easy. So they got, Ken Manning or somebody who was Capcom, and read the time up, and I've noted it down. Frank said, check it, and he was checking the clock. And we came around, and sure enough, boy, the radio went dead right at the instant. Frank went, boy, that's a relief. And I said something which he'll hate me for the rest of his life. I said, Frank, those are our buddies down there. They're going to cut that radio off. And he gave me, he called me a 3-letter word.
But like Bill said, we weren't sure, but Lovell was amazingly accurate with that onboard sextant. And although we depended and used the ground radar for our navigation, we were pretty sure we were on track the whole time, right?
Actually, that's true. As a matter of fact, the orbital mechanics and the operation of the flight worked perfectly. The time did stop exactly when we thought it was going to. I mean, the communication shut off at the proper time. We lit the engine. The engine, of course, was controlled by the computer, And it counted down right. We had the right countdown. And of course, we're behind the moon, so the ground had no idea what we were doing. The engine lit, and of course, as it slowed us down, then right on orbit, we saw the readouts of the computer, and when we came around to the near side, I read off the orbit around the moon, and it was just what we wanted to be. And so
Worked perfectly.
That engine worked perfectly.
Tell what you were doing. How were you navigating at that point?
Well, a lot of what I had to do was keep the gyros synced with the attitude. And so I had to take sightings on the stars. And I'll admit one thing that I did too.
But because if you don't, I will admit it.
I want to head them off in the past. My job basically was to keep the platform.
He'll tell his version and we'll tell ours.
The platform aligned with the celestial sphere, because that's how we knew our attitude within space. And so we had to do the work all the time. The way I did it was down in the computer, and the computer was of course, by today's standard, it was very elementary, but actually in those days, it was really, really a great little device. And I would go into the computer, and I would tell the computer that I wanted to sight on a star. And I went in there, and there's 37 of them, and I picked a number of the star I wanted to sight on. And if the star was behind the Earth, the Sun, or the Moon, it would come up and say, "Hey, dummy, pick another star, you can't use this one." So then I pick a star that I could use, I hit the button, the proceed button, and the spacecraft would then go around and aim, and then the optics would go up and aim at the star. And I looked through a little telescope, and if the star was not on the crosshairs, I could manually put it on the crosshair, punch a button, it would record the 3 angles and the time. I did this with 3 stars. It was an amazing device. It was really great. We were transmitting this information back down to the ground so they could see how well this whole system was working. And I got so that I was playing it almost like a pianist playing a Steinway. I was so fast at this stuff, and all the information was coming down very, very accurate. But on the way home, I got too fast, and I was playing with it, thinking that I was very great at doing this job. And I went in and I punched the wrong button. Instead of saying I wanted to align the platform, I punched in the button that told the computer and the guidance system that we were back at the launch pad waiting to take off.
The spacecraft thought it was back at the Cape.
Yeah. And so the attitude indicator went zap, and everything went blank. We lost all of our attitude reference with, of course, the celestial sphere. These guys are having fits, and they're wondering whether we're ever going to get back. And then what I had to do was
Let me add right there that Frank was sleeping. So I was on watch, and I kind of just waited there, nothing in Lovell was building. Suddenly Lovell goes, "Oops." Coincidentally, the attitude reference ball starts to move. Now, I had been to Capcom for what was Neil and Dave Scott's flight where they came over rolling. So I was kind of primed to stuck thrusters. And coincidentally, about the time Jim said, "Oops, a thruster fired." So I thought we had a stuck thruster. So I came in with the hand controller to counteract this movement. Well, the spacecraft really wasn't moving. It was the ball, but it was moving once I put the needle in. Now the space, and I noticed that the light on the dust, there were little dust motes in there, and the light was going the wrong way. So I used the ray of light in the spacecraft to steady it out, and by that time, Frank was up giving a lot of help.
we had never
only had about 3 hours to re-entry too, so
we had never planned to lose our attitude reference in Apollo. We wanted to run it all the time, and of course we lost it. And but there was a backup procedure. I had to go out the window and manually get the spacecraft around and look at a star and say, "Okay, is that Regulus?"
we couldn't see the stars because there's a lot of sunlight and urine crystals floating around with us.
But finally, we did a backup procedure, which turned out to be very, very accurate, and we got back up.
It was amazing because Jim could reorient the platform. This inertial platform was designed at MIT. And the initial thought was we would let the inertial platform run the whole time. I mean, we would turn it off except when we were burning the space. In other words, you'd get a platform up, you'd orient the spacecraft where you want it, fire the rocket, then you'd turn the platform off to save electricity. But I didn't like that based on my experience. If you got something running, leave it alone. So I wrote a letter to the Apollo. This tells you how wonderful NASA was at that time. I wrote a letter to the Apollo program officer saying, you know, I think we ought to let it run. And they forwarded it to MIT, and I got a letter back from MIT, 2 pages. I wish I'd have kept the darn thing. That said all the reasons that it was designed to be shut off and turned back on. And it was signed by the lead engineer, and then at the bottom he had a postscript. It said, P.S. If I were going on this mission, I'd let the damn thing run. And as far as I know, it ran, except on Apollo 13, it ran full time on every mission. I really thought that was great.
It was very fortunate that I had that experience because on 13 we had a shuttle.
Yeah.
And so it all came back to me.
You all don't understand how close they came to buying the farm on 13. That was close.
And we'll get to that in a minute.
Okay.
I'm just wondering, was oops a prelude to Houston, we have a problem? Now we come to one of the most interesting times of your flight, I think. One of the most interesting times of your flight. You know you're in a safe orbit now around the moon, and you come around for the first time, and although you were telling me before it might not have been the first time when you saw Earthrise, what was that like in that wonderful picture that we see over here?
Well, we were on the 3rd revolution. We'd been going backwards and upside down, so we didn't see the Earth for the first 2 or 3 revolutions. And then Frank reoriented the spacecraft, and I think we made some of a burn in the meantime. And I was busy taking pictures of the backside of the moon according to a very detailed photographic plan, which had nothing in it about taking pictures of the Earth. So as the spacecraft came around and the Earth appeared to be rising, actually it really wasn't, but it appeared to be. I think Frank saw it, Jim saw it, I was looking off the side. Probably Frank snapped off the first picture. Unfortunately, he didn't have the long lens and the color film. So he started screaming and throwing the camera, and finally I trained this big camera around and just started snapping pictures and changing the f-stop. And fortunately, one of them was chosen by NASA to be the iconic Earthrise picture.
That's not the complete story. The complete story is, the complete story, Jim and I were yelling at Anders, take that picture, and he came back and said, that's not on the flight plan. We're not Isn't that true?
No. Maybe it was. I was a captain. I was going to do my job. I didn't want to get spanked by Chris Grafflin.
He was only supposed to take pictures of the moon.
But it was amazing to me that we'd spent all this time with geology training and photographing the moon and understanding lunar craters. In fact, I even named a bunch of lunar craters on the flight. And yet, after about the 3rd revolution, the moon was clearly kind of a boring place. Nothing but holes and holes upon holes. And it always seemed ironic to me that we'd really come to discover the moon, and yet when we saw the Earthrise, we really kind of discovered the Earth.
I think that was one of the greatest experiences and things that we brought back from that Apollo 8 flight was really our perspective in the universe and in the solar system, and how small body that we all lived in, and that it was really sort of like a spacecraft with about 6 billion astronauts all striving for the same things out of life.
Christmas Eve, the 3 of you took turns reading the first 10 chapters of the book of Genesis, the home base of 3 great religions. Whose idea was that? Where did that come from? And I guess you guys know what a thrill it gave most people to hear that on that night.
Well,
tell me the story of that.
we had we were told by NASA that we would have the largest audience that had ever listened to a human voice before on Christmas Eve. And the only instructions that we got from NASA, can you imagine this happening today, Tom? Was do something appropriate. Do something appropriate.
Boy, from what we've heard tonight, that was a risk.
I knew a very, well, we all knew Cy Morgan, and I asked him, and he went to one of his friends, Joe Layton, who was a newspaper man. And I guess they sat up all night trying to figure out something, and finally Joe's wife came down and said, well, you idiots, the answer is in the first 10 verses of Genesis. And they put it in the white planet. I came back and asked Jim and Bill about it, and they all, I think you thought it was appropriate. I can't take any credit for it. It was Cy and Joe that did it. It was perfect. It worked. Yeah.
Yeah, I did it, I think we all, not so much as a religious story, but really just to set the somber tone for people who first, when mankind first left the earth.
You know, this flight couldn't have been scripted by a screenwriter any better than it actually came out to be. And it was, a lot of it was coincidence, the fact that when we determined the time that we had to go to the moon, the timing of it was on December 21st. We had orbited the moon on Christmas Eve. And those of you who remember 1968 was a very, troubled year in this country with the war and assassinations and the riots. Yet we were able, at the very end, to circle the moon, to do something positive, and at the same time come up with a saying that was so appropriate at that particular time.
I think almost as much as anything else, that gets played over and over. You hear Neil say that's one small step, but you also hear the Genesis reading and you see these pictures. And this was from a flight that never landed on the moon. It was setting the stage. Okay, we're almost to the end. Then we have a couple of microphones out here.
Can I add one thing here? I owe it to these guys.
Well, let me just finish one thing. We're going to let you have a chance to ask some questions. We'll have 15 or 20 minutes. I'm sorry, Bill.
We were around the moon. We were going to make the burn to get out from behind the moon. And we were going to do that out of sight of the Earth's radars and telemetry. And going back to this same thing about the time signal, that if we made a successful burn, we would pop out from behind the moon early. But if the engine didn't like it, we were going to become permanent monuments to this Apollo folly, there would be a distinct difference in the time. And one of my jobs was to orient the high gain antenna every time we'd come around and make sure it was pointing at the Earth when we popped out. Well, the engine burned just right, and you could just see the moon moving away. We were taking pictures, and I forgot to orient the antenna. So we popped out, and about the time we would have had radio contact had we not orbited, I thought, oh, the antenna. And it turned around. And I guess there was, even though Lovell says there was a Santa Claus, there was a lot of heart failure down here. So I want to tell you that I owe all you guys a drink, and I'm buying it.
There's one more story about that burn, though, that I've never repeated before, but it sticks in my mind when I think about this flight. You know, when we got all set up to make that burn, Lovell had to punch the button and started the countdown so the engine would run. And we're getting all ready, and the time is coming down, and Lovell's got his finger pointing. He looks at me and says, "Are you sure you want to do this?" You remember that?
Actually, the computer said about 5 seconds before the burn to come, it came up with a number that essentially said, are you really sure that you want to make this thing? And I was ready to punch, and Borman says, punch the button.
I was reaching over to punch it. Okay.
There are a couple of questions before we go out to the audience, and I'm not sure how we're going to do this, but there's a microphone over here, and I think one over here. So if you have a burning question, go ahead and get lined up there. We'll come to you in just a minute. There are a couple of things that I think we need to talk about here. What do you guys think right now about going back to the moon? We've got a program that's going to take us back there, and then the discussion is going on to Mars someday. Is that a good deal? Should we have gone 40 years ago, kept the program going, or?
Well, I frankly was a little disappointed that we canceled Skylab so rapidly. Shuttle's been a spectacular vehicle, but it's been an expensive one. We're going to go back to the moon someday. You know, NASA seems to have a good plan in my mind. But keep in mind that we don't have the Cold War. And the Cold War was a major stimulus to Apollo. And so as much as everybody wants a nice picture for Hubble and explore the moon again, I don't think we have the same groundswell of taxpayer support for it. As far as going to Mars, it's a long way. You know, Chuck Berry, and you think guys are going to be out of shape and gals when they get there. But I would hope that when we finally figure out how to go to Mars, and I think it'll be considerably longer than what I've heard, we could do it not as Americans beating the Chinese or some silly thing like that, but we could do it as humans, going from our home planet to the next planet. And that doesn't seem to be happening.
Well, I can't quite agree with that. I think that there's a lot of cooperation now with a lot of the countries working together as a consortium.
The Soviet vehicle.
Well, the problem, the short-term problem right now is the fact that shortly the shuttle system will be taken out of service, retired, and we're going to rely on the Russians for maybe the next 4 or 5 years to supply the space station, and hopefully that the space station is complete, because I think the modules, if there are any left to be put up there, can only be put up by the orbiters. And so that is probably a short-term problem that we're looking at right now.
Frank?
Well, I think that Jim is going more up on it than I am. I'm glad I was at NASA right at the period I was there. We had the motivation, and we had the leadership with President Johnson and Jim Webb, and we had the talent right here, and we did the job. I think that going to Mars is going to be a very, very long-term project. I get concerned now when I read about the turmoil in NASA about whether we picked the right booster to go back to the moon or not. I can't imagine that happening in the NASA that I know. I think probably Dr. Von Braun would have shot the guy that was there. I'm an old guy, and I'm probably more skeptical about what the thing. We may be building windmills instead of going to Mars.
You lead me into the last question I want to ask, and then we'll go to the audience. The three of you guys, and myself to a certain extent, born during the Depression. How did that affect the way you thought about things, and as you came into this great world of technology? It was quite a trek from where you guys started to where you ended up. Jim?
Well, I feel very, very fortunate. Of course, I was born in 1928. That was just before the Depression, and lived through the Depression as a young kid. Didn't have much money. Lost my father at a very early age, and couldn't go to college. Didn't have the money to go to college until I got into a naval aviation program, an ROTC program, and eventually led me to the academy. So that's how I got my education. And it sort of, I did things that I always dreamed about but never thought I'd get there. I was always interested in rockets, and suddenly there I was a naval aviator, and something I wanted to do too, and the two things came together in the space program. And, I was in the original selection back in 1958 for the original Mercury people, and there's 32 of us, and Pete and I were in there, Pete Conrad and I. We didn't make it, so I was very, very much disappointed. And then when Chimney came around, then I was selected. So I feel happy. I think I had a very fine career coming out of the Depression and the conditions I was in to where I am now.
Frank?
Well, Jim and my experience about the same. We're a lot older than Bill is. The Depression, though, for people that can't remember. It was a sobering experience. We grew up in Tucson, dirt poor. I didn't have the money to go to college, so I volunteered to enlist in the, you couldn't enlist it, you were drafted in the Army because they had the GI Bill. But in the meantime, through the quirk, I got a third all-in appointment to West Point, and the other 3 guys ahead of me flunked or quit or something, and I was there, and I just feel very lucky. But you know, we didn't have health insurance, we didn't have my job. My dad didn't have a job half the time. I had to hitchhike to West Point, and so it was a different world. The expectations of the people today are a hell of a lot more than ours were. And the strange thing is, growing up in Arizona like that, I never really felt poor because everybody else was in the same boat.
I didn't have the depression experience. Indeed, they are a lot older than me. So maybe I'm so old, I just can't remember. But my dad was in the Navy over in China when the Sino-Japanese War broke out. So I was over there, and my mom and I had a hard time escaping from Nanking when it was being raped. And so that sort of burned a military career for me. Followed my dad at the Naval Academy, but then jumping ship, going to the Air Force, and then chasing Russians around over the Arctic Ocean. So to me, everything just is like everybody else does. Things just fell one step after another, and frankly, I was really surprised that I got selected for the program, but I was all for it.
Okay, there's some lights on, so I have a hard time sitting out there, but I see some folks over at the microphone over here. Do you have questions for Frank and Jim and Bill?
I'd like to start with a rather provocative question after Frank brought up his throwing up. Was there an odor problem, or did that dissipate?
There was more, well, I'm sworn I won't tell what else went on. Definitely an odor problem in there, and because of the fire, they put in some oxygen mask, and even though it was absolutely verboten, I figured, I don't care what Chris and his guys say, I'm going to take that oxygen mask and slap it on.
Over here, yes.
Is there any possible way of comparing the G-forces to anything?
G-forces. Anything else than your experiences compared to G-forces? Okay.
Well, you can experience 0 G in a swimming pool. Just go down to the deep end and get by the ladder and blow your air out and just float there, and that's kind of what 0 feels like. Or get in an airplane, and if you're a fighter pilot, and it might be easy.
I mean the high G-forces.
The high G-forces. I don't know any other way you get high G-forces.
Well, something at a
Centrifuge.
where they swing around, you get there.
Over here?
I was wondering, after being the first humans to see the moon in such a close range, were your thoughts about it changed in any way?
Were your thoughts changed?
Your thoughts changed in any way about the moon, seeing it so close?
Well, personally, my thoughts haven't changed. A lot of times people will tell me, are you closer to God being 240,000 miles out? And I always say for myself, no, because God is down here on Earth as well as He is out there around the moon. So my philosophy, my thoughts have not changed from my space flights.
I feel the same way.
I was a little bit influenced by Arthur Clarke's 2001, where he had sharp corners on the moon. Let me tell you, it's sandblasted.
Okay, on this side.
It's kind of related, it's a generational question. My aunts and uncles are of your generation, and when I speak to them about the program, I get a sense that in some ways Apollo 8 was the major paradigm shift, because for people, my generation and many, I was 5 years old when you went, going to the moon has been done. We live in a different world today because that's been done and all that. The moon used to be the unattainable. How was your sense on the inside? Was there any sense of things have just changed in the outlook on the entire, the world stage, or was the focus in the program completely